Hi everyone, Mike Levin here, Thursday, August 2nd, 2018, around 8:30 a.m. and I'm here in this stunningly gorgeous, I guess, salt marsh renewal area here in Stapleton. And ever make mistakes in life? Let's make them birds. Yeah, they're birds now. So, you know, I'm going on 50 years old in a couple of years, and I'm at the, I guess, third leg of what I see as a three-legged adventure, each one corresponding to one of the friends in Wizard of Oz. So Scarecrow, done deal. But as Salvador Dali says, intelligence without courage is like a bird without wings. So if I only had the heart I am now, I believe, after having brought a child into this world, and I think being a pretty good dad, found my heart. I'm no longer the Tin Man. I'm no longer the Scarecrow. And so, you know, that leaves me as being the Cowardly Lion, and yeah, guilty as charged. I'm I guess say, a very different person underneath than the image I guess so naturally project. I don't try and do it, but this, you know, pseudo erudition routine just, you know, rolls off naturally, I guess, as a product of the search engine optimization field that I'm in. And like my dad in New York before me, the industry is undergoing rapid change. My dad was a typical textile Jew, refer to Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book, Return. Yeah, my dad was one of those. He wanted to be a NASA engineer and was talked in by his uncles who were already in the textile business. A Jew really had to be here in order to make it in New York, so he switched to textiles, and the textiles industry dried up underneath of him. And that, I guess, has set the tone for everything ever since in my life. I repeat my dad's patterns, no big deal. I'm doing it eyes wide open, and I have the courage to do things he had not. And I believe my mom would have said the courage that my dad lacked was to go into business for himself. But you know what? I try the consultancy gig, the ultimate responsibility on your back, and every time I do, I have flashbacks to my dad saying all his life it was just much easier to punch a clock and to collect a paycheck, and amen to that. It's like renting versus owning. I've had the opportunity to own a couple of times. I'm my second New York co-op in my New York experience here. The first one being a Manhattan co-op, being, oh no thanks, thanks for offering though. The Manhattan co-op being everything of the, you know, satirical, farcical image that Googling on the internet about New York co-ops will produce. These are those people who filter for people like them. We got into that community, and probably not for the better. We would have been better off. It would have been less strain on us over the years had we just continued being renters or gotten a condo instead of a co-op. And I'm at my second co-op, and I'm learning all the same lessons. I mean, the worst of people is brought out in co-ops. The tribal roles are just at that right size that I always talk about, 30 to 50 people, the size at which who we are as an actual animal comes right to the surface. Because while yes, society and, you know, cooperation and everything that goes into social interaction is necessary for human groups of those sizes, really thoughtful, considerate, intelligent thinking is not. It is more the animal selves that motivate people at those small tribal levels, and that all comes right to the surface in these New York co-ops, let me tell you. New York, in this case, being New York State, because that's my my cabin in the mountains, my cottage, my bungalow. It's part of a community, with a community across the street that represents all my friends from back in Inwood, which is amazing. Not all my friends, but an interesting selection of friends. So I want to get to what I'm thinking through, what I'm forcing myself to think through today. And I'll walk some different paths here just to mix it up a bit. And I'll try and keep this on the short side. I see I'm already up to 5 minutes and I'm just rambling about situations. But situations are important. The belief that you can pull things out of context and still do the calculations you intend to do is nonsense. You need to understand context because observation is informed by the self-aware knowledge of the context you're observing from. So you can have appropriate filters so you're not overwhelmed by the raw data, etc., etc. So things started out very grid-like in technology and science because relational database management systems, RDBMSs, which are of the likes of Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server and Postgres and MySQL, and generally you see the SQL trend there. Their main interface to these types of information systems, minus spreadsheets, which we'll talk about in a second because they use the same rigid row and column data structure view of the world, they all use structured query language, SQL, so that the tables can be treated as less of a list of records and more like sets of collections of things to be selected along with other collections of things that reside elsewhere. And SQL does the job of knitting those two things together into one so you can treat two tables as one. There's a lot more to SQL than that, but the ability to join data across tables is an essential one. It's often called joins, and there's left joins and there's right joins and there's inners and there's outers, but you know, by far the most common case that you want to master is you got a list on the left, and for every record on the left you want there to be a match to the record on the right. And if there are records on the left that don't match to the right, shall I still include the left? Yes, that's a left outer. Left outers are the most common types of joins. If you wanted to filter, and you almost never do left inners, you would do a right join and just switch the nomenclature around. And in fact, you're always trying to make the table on the left the master list, so you just change your query around so you refer to that table first. So, I mean, in almost all cases, you're doing a type of join that is analogous to a VLOOKUP in Excel. Hence, the connection between the row and column world in the database land and the row and column world in the spreadsheet land, which is almost the same, but for its API program interface. So spreadsheets are made to be used by visual people, visual thinker, people who need their tools in point and click form, even though spreadsheets started out before the days of point and click on the Apple II with VisiCalc, but they've come a long way since, going through, you know, Lotus 1, 2, 3, right? And Excel took that over, and to this day now, I guess the only real viable competition for Excel on the desktop is Google Docs, which happens to have a spreadsheet thing, Google Sheets, which happens to have a very capable web API, which means that you can manipulate through programming code speaking. You can talk a spreadsheet into doing a song and dance for you. I think people frequently misunderstand the terms coding and programming. And so what I'm trying to do is to bring to the masses the belief, the understanding that it's no different than talking. Sometimes when showing a piece of program code and I'm working interactively with other people in a work session, I read through the code to understand what it's doing, and I might be called out or challenged on it, going, I thought you wrote this. I'm like, well, you might have written an email 2 years ago, but when you pull it up, you don't instantly know everything that's in it, you reread it. So programming languages are just like spoken and written languages. It's just a series of words. Everything is just twiddling bits. There is nothing that is not ultimately the arrangements of ones and zeros in a Turing machine, especially in the computing world. I'd argue that it's in the real world as well, but for the sake of making this a professional discussion about figuring out next steps, we'll just talk about the computing world. So the arrangements of ones and zeros through various APIs and such are turned into the arrangements of words on the screen. Sometimes it's changed into little things that you drag around in visual programming languages, but for the sake of our discussion, it's mostly just typing in. You can just forget the mouse for most of what I advocate, not the entire thing. So old school tools will allow you to have muscle memory to make you more expert at what you do, increasingly over the years as you put in the 10 years or 10,000 hours that you need to put in, again, per Malcolm Gladwell's Outlier book. I'm a fan of all these business and science, pop culture books that popularize a mathematical term like long tail or outliers. Malcolm Gladwell's probably one of the first and best to do it. Jeffrey Moore with Crossing the Chasm and stuff, he was pretty big too. But lately, Malcolm Gladwell has been getting the biggest home runs, and the biggest one, in my opinion, of recent years has been Outliers. And if you want to just get the shifts and changes that are happening in the world, that's the book to read, because it touches on so many critical self-improvement points. So the field of search engine optimization is drying up around me, or at least dramatically changing in the very same ways as textiles did for my dad. And whereas my dad got into check cashing, bought himself a business, which I had to take over and ended up having to shoot a guy who tried to attack me and rob me, which transitioned into other crazy experiences I had as my mom dealt with mental health issues. I basically became, I got a Batman complex. I pretty much figured I can do anything because I do anything. There's pretty much nothing outside my capabilities. My view of the world clicked into place as I realized there's nothing that anybody else can do that is that smart or special that you couldn't do with sufficient study and practice. There's a couple of them that are really big, like law and medicine, because people's lives are at stake when you take up one of those trades, to varying degrees depending on the types of law and medicine. Some are more respectable than others. Lies are everywhere. The real number system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is lie. All languages are lies per the Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Every mathematical system has the same flaw. So, using language at all, one of our most powerful tools for communicating and living and surviving, is just riddled with inconsistencies and flaws. So everything is suspect. So everything you're told is not really necessarily true. So it's up to you to observe, playing the observation game, intensely critical to your long-term success. Making those observations in almost a talking out loud format. So journaling, you ought to journal. There's all kinds of ways to journal, but if you're going to be journaling, get your hours of practice in on Vim. Create one text file in one repository in GitHub or Bitbucket. If you want to be a freeloader, use a private repo in Bitbucket. They don't charge you. If you want to start creating your positive mojo in this world, pay the $80 a year to have private, unlimited repos on GitHub. That's what I do. But because I do my journaling so many places, if GitHub ever really went away, no big deal. I have the entirety of the repo in every place where I do my journaling, and I simply, I guess, go over to Bitbucket temporarily while I figure out my next step. Maybe by that time I'll be hosting my own GitHub repos, and they'll just pop up in locations of my determining in sort of a whack-a-mole fashion, and I won't even be reliant on some hosted service to see my stuff, because private journals, and you can put the private in private journals one day. Truth is, I never put anything there that's that sensitive, but I do use it to play the observation game and navigate my way through life, exactly as I'm doing in these videos. I find that life is too short to edit. I don't edit my journals. I don't publish most of them. On occasion I do, because my journal is always loaded in one buffer in Vim, and I switch to the other buffer, which is the public journal, and I just copy paste between two Vim instances, which is really easy to do. Copy pasting with outside tools like, you know, between Microsoft Word and Vim is always going to be a unique challenge, but copying between Vim buffers, no big deal. So by copying from my private journal to my public journal, it just auto publishes into the Pipulate repository, which has a previous project that's been killed, a previous generation of Pipulate, as I reboot it under Jupyter Notebook, because even though I advocate using the type-in interface most of the time, eventually as you become a master and forget about the mouse more and more, I advocate that as you're getting started to not jump directly into the deep end with Vim. Instead, use Jupyter Notebook, which gets installed with the Anaconda install. So you just go to Google and you search on Anaconda. After the snake entry will be the Continuum.io company's entry. Click on that and download Anaconda with Python 3.6, maybe 3.7 or 0.8 by the time you read this, for your desktop OS. Generally, it's going to be 64-bit Windows or 64-bit Mac. It also works on a Linux desktop running GNOME or KDE, so, you know, have fun. Download it, install it, and then depending on your operating system, go find Jupyter Notebook in the Applications folder or on the Start menu or wherever, and it'll pop up your default browser, usually Chrome, and it'll have a directory listing, and you go to the upper right and you go File, New Python 3, and bam, a new tab opens. That's called a notebook. That notebook is very similar to a Mathematica notebook on which Jupyter Notebook is closely modeled, which I do believe came from Wolfram Alpha, who was one of the driving forces behind Apple's innovations over the years, as Steve Jobs checked with his friend Stephen Wolfram on various issues, getting his respected opinion. Steve Jobs didn't respect a lot of people's opinions because of that whole lie thing I'm talking about. And so he did respect Stephen's opinions, who gave him such wonderful insights as base the Mac on Unix and you can't go wrong. And so because of Stephen Wolfram, the same guy as behind Mathematica and the search engine, Wolfram Alpha, and the app by that name, and the subscription service, and the whole line of search that did not take off as the super popular thing, because Larry Page and Sergey Brin and PageRank, written in Python by the way, were there first, and you know, had a bigger PR success sooner. Could have been Wolfram. At any rate, where was I going? It was the Mac, the Unix, starting easy. And yes, starting easy, it means, you know, using these notebook things which let you run Python code in a web browser, in a web form that you submit, or I think it's Shift-Enter is a keyboard shortcut. And it starts to even have all the keyboard shortcut kind of things that the old school people like me want. And browsers are, of course, getting better and better and more efficient and faster in the browser wars, and JavaScript runs better, so the you know, interactivity is always improving. It becomes more like a native desktop app all the time. So in that environment, the web browser, you run genuine Python code. You might think, well, this is just some sort of silly Python emulation. No, it's the same CPython run in a virtual machine that's instantiated per notebook you create. Each tab is a sandbox separate CPython reference specification, modified a little bit for this Jupyter Notebook environment. For I/O stuff, there's issues. Each tab is its own Python. So you want concurrency, run 2 jobs side by side in 2 different tabs. Run, go over here, run. They're running in parallel, trust me. Probably in a better way or easier API-wise than many of the other ways to get concurrency. But of course, Jupyter Notebook is an interactive environment, REPL, REPL, run, execute, print loop, which is a very unusual environment. It's roughly analogous to using a visual code editor like Eclipse for Java. People use that a lot. Xcode, the Apple people use that. And Visual Studio, which the Windows people use a lot. They all have a feature called breakpoints, which lets you start to run your code and then stop at a breakpoint and inspect the contents of variables and stuff. And it's something special. It's like a special mode you're in. Oh, it's a breakpoint. So REPL environments are like that, but they just make that the default. You're always able to just inspect the code, and it only executes up to the end of your stacked web forms. So you can just stack web forms and say run this little bit of code or run this little bit of code, and it's very illuminating and enlightening. You can insert new code blocks above and below, and these code blocks that run in these web forms are independent of the programming language code blocks, which is controlled through indenting in Python and curly brackets and many other languages. So what I'm saying, it's almost inconsequential, how you do your code blocks in your code, because you can just run a line at a time if you wanted lots of little web forms stacked on top of each other and inspect all the contents of your variables and objects. Tempted to call it variables, but in Python they're hardly even variables. They're references to these rich data objects, roughly analogous, just the heck with it, right? Roughly analogous to JSON objects in the JavaScript world, you see, because Python objects, just objects that are in Python. Everything is an object. They're usually some combination of string or integer or list, tuple, or dictionary. Those are the 3 special data types that get thrown in addition to numbers and letters to make Python rich enough to support most of the use cases that Guido van Rossum, the creator of Python, saw as the things that people are most likely to need to do. So you don't have to keep recreating your own libraries as people did in C back in the day, or go hunting for libraries to just do simple things that should have been included in core. So in Python, there's 2 levels of core, really. There's what gets loaded in memory just right off the bat, because most people use these things most of the time, including lists, where you can add to a list, remove from a list, get slices of a list, step over a list. They're dynamic stacks or heaps, whatever. Then there's dictionaries, which are key value pairs. If you put in, A, you get, apple. If you put in B, you get bet, whatever. So key value pairs is dictionaries. It's roughly equivalent to the NoSQL movement, another way to think about databases. But they've always been doing that anyway. It's just a 2-column table with one column being your key and your other column being your value, and the rest is, algorithms to get to that point fast when you do a query. I'm heading sort of to the St. George Ferry here, and it's getting a bit ugly. It's not a pretty walk, so I'm going to turn around and go back to where it's a little more pretty. It is interesting, though. Here, you can rent a fence. It has lots of parallels to the coding world, and programming versus hacking. So you can always get something to work, and you can get something to work generally more quickly, better. They used to call it bumming it. playing to the hardware more than the operating system and the development tools. Whenever you talk right to the hardware, you can make the hardware sing and dance in ways that the operating system and layer people really can't. Everything is an abstraction so that your code is portable. And you generally do want to be in that world where you're making your code more and more abstract, more and more portable, but you don't want to be so much in that world that all your code performance sucks. You instead want to land somewhere in the middle or get the advantages of each one when you want to. But there's not enough time in a life to master more than 1 or 2 pieces of hardware. Again, refer to Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000, hours or 10 years, whichever comes first. Each piece of hardware is going to be one of those units because it's really tough to program for the hardware. The old Atari and Commodore people used to do that in the 8-bit world, and that's why they squeezed so much performance out of those machines that you see referred to in movies like Ready Player One, the Atari 2600 that started it all as far as home computer exposure. A few people had Pong before that, and a few people started out with Intellivision or some other thing that was around at the time. But from that point on, it's been a movement towards both more capable and more abstracted hardware. So you put common APIs, the proprietary people, the people who sell products that they don't want copied, try and avoid this, talk right to the hardware, or they develop their own APIs and keep them as private in-house things, entire development suites that deal with all the complexities of the hardware. And so there's often a lot of competition and territorialism and tool guarding. I'm here to tear down that tool guarding and territorialism, which even persists to this day in the quote free and open source world in the form of Java and the attitude that Java developers tend to have in their billable hour world that they found post Visual Basic 6.0. They all had somewhere to go, so they flocked over to Java because .NET was a mixed bag. So that Java consulting world exists there, pseudo free and open source, lots of proprietary implementations of Java, lots of proprietary implementations of Python too. So everyone's guilty of everything, and everything has the same flaws. Every language is Turing complete that can, run and do anything any other language can. So, it's easy to whitewash all the details that are really important. There's a lot of stuff out there that's easy to overlook, and the vendor people and the loyalists to strange platforms often want you to overlook that, to not drill down in the details. So what I'm doing in my repositioning of myself from the field of search engine optimization to the field of data mastering is to just generically do all those things that SQL people do in the completely free and open source world, and to be able to take on the types of projects that data scientists, those people labeled data scientists a bit pretentiously, are rallying under. There's also machine learning. Takes a little bit of hardware resources and control that I don't have right now, but it can all be rented from the cloud cheaply. You don't need to build your own hardware. Sometimes there's advantages of doing so. I fell in love with the Amiga computer many years ago in the late 80s, early 90s. I was very passionate about it, went to shareholder meetings, talked to Al Haig, who was on the board of directors, along with Irving Gould, the money man, and Mehdi Ali, the hatchet man who mangled the Commodore computers that a lot of us remember from our youth, and replaced it with something that took a nosedive because whatever, I don't know. But I fell in love with the Amiga computer, which was in the lineage of the Atari 2600, but was acquired by Commodore because the people who quit Atari and tried to start their own company ran out of money, had to sell. Long story short, Commodore ended up with a technology, and it was a machine that could sing and dance. There was a lot of motivation to learn the hardware. I never really coded for it. Manx C, there was a lot of stuff I tried in those days. I learned the Cygnus editor really well. But what I did learn is that certain tools have sort of a magic to them, a certain getting better over time aspect, that if only the platform stayed around long run, you would ascend to this level of wizard that is that you just desire to be, and you're not, because the vendors keep resetting and resetting and resetting, Photoshop changing, you know, Microsoft Office changing, the ribbon being added, going to subscription services, different models of payment, struggling for them to survive in the modern world where you can just use the free web stuff or a plethora of open source alternatives, a arms race of features that they're going to try and make you think are necessary, but really the small tool set that should fit in your brain and be committed to muscle memory instantaneously are in the free and open source world across the board in almost all cases. There's a few being filled in, and people keep posting on my YouTube videos more and more ideas, like for the 2D animation world, the 2D printing world, the replacements for Quark Express, and the replacements for Flash, vector animation. There's a few that are still in their primitive stages, but they are coming around little by little. And, you know, I'm going to be there generally learning them, taking them up. GIMP and Inkscape are two of the essentials. Trying to develop that muscle memory, but as a just real light side task, and I'll be commenting on them. But the main deal is mastering Vim and what you can be like in the terminal as you're coding in Python in Vim, the Vim text editor, and using the Python programming language for maximum expressiveness and readability, and just thinking in code the way you would think in English, much easier in fact. The ascendance to mastery in that realm, which everyone should be doing because that whole tool stack is in the free and open source world. Getting to that through Jupyter Notebook in your web browser from the Anaconda install, so that you can run Python hello world with just typing hello world with double or single quotes around it, doesn't matter which. Just new notebook, hello world, quotes around it, control enter or the run button. Congratulations, you're a programmer. The rest is details. I'll explain why that works without a print statement, because Jupyter Notebook and all the rest of that stuff, as I start to give you first-hand experience on the left-hand side here with Jupyter Notebook, and start to flesh out the details of why everything is so wonderful and great here on the right-hand side with the old school tools, Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. LPvg, capital L, capital P, lowercase v, lowercase g. It's a platform, it's a stack, it's a tool set, it's whatever nomenclature you want to use, but it's a Swiss Army knife of tech that you can master and tackle most problems most of the times in most of the fields that are demanding most of the money for people who have skills in those fields, and just to carry that around in your back pocket to whatever else you take up, which is also worthwhile, probably also very sexy, because it's good to have multiple views of the world. My old school one is just one, and even I admit its own weaknesses to such a large extent that I'm getting you started with something else that's helping scientists deal with their crisis of accountability that set in a few years back, as they found out that a full third of all scientific research was unreproducible, given the same data sets, given the same everything, except for the exact process, i.e. Jupyter Notebook. Jupyter Notebook, I guess I gotta learn to use that as a noun, which could be under Python or other programming languages, including R, which gets installed in along with Python, so you can experiment with the R, also free and open source statistical language. Machine learning is at your fingertips. You can experiment with TensorFlow and many things like it. Scikit-learn is just built into Python as part of the core. There's two different types of core. There's the core where things you can just type freely, and then there's another type of thing where you have to import library name, and then that becomes available under that namespace. There's a file sitting somewhere that hasn't been loaded into memory yet because you don't need it under all situations, and Python needs your help to manage its memory. It doesn't have regular expressions built in and ready to use for one-liners the way Ruby does. So Python is not a panacea. It's got its weaknesses, but wait till you learn about things like list comprehension. It's just so many beautiful things that you get for free that allow you to pivot this way and that to make the most elegant, expressive, and readable again in the future. It's not obfuscation. When you become elegant and expressive in Python, you're making things that other people are going to look at and go, oh, yeah, that's of course the way to do that, not what the heck is going on. And all these things appeal to my generally, sharing, altruistic, the journey is the reward. Who's to say what we're really going to be measured on in the end as far as, purpose and meaning, so given that everything is some form of lie, and that the most trustable things you'll ever experience are conclusions you draw from your own observation, why not start living life by your own rules, within those, confines of reasonably established by society, but also remember people are sheep. Most people are just believing the lie, and they believe the first thing told to them. Not if you want to have a really good life. Not if you want to do the things you believe in and stand up to people who advocate things you fundamentally don't. And to avoid being coerced into situations where you're going to be unhappy for long, long stretches because of things that you bought into, reject those presumptions right at the outset. Don't go down that path that traps you in. And know that you can undo. Know that you can always step back and you can rethink things. You can change your mind. And even though, in opinions like mine, life is too short for editing, knowing that how you tell your story to people and represent yourself and make yourself accessible will affect how much you can convert who you are into currency in the who you are versus what you know game. Who you are is ultimately more powerful, but what you know can always boot you from scratch. Not frequently to the delight of those who need who you know to be true. They need who you know to be true. So they're not always thrilled with someone who thrives in a what you know world starting to do well for themselves. If you feel someone putting their hand on your head and starting to push you down, know that's what's happening and correct your situation. Challenge their presumptions. Say, let's go through what you're saying and see if I believe this. Now, people are often so invested in their position in life or whatever that they will reject obvious truth no matter how compelling it is. So shine the light on the situation. You need lots of people around you so that objective reality arises from statistical opinion, insofar as objectivity really exists. The more eyeballs on it, the more light being shined on a topic, the more likely a correct position is to rise to the surface. So if you find yourself being pushed around or bullied by, say, like co-ops or something, just shine the light of accountability onto it. Bring the story to the public. Lay it out in the most dry, documentary, unopinionated way. Both sides will have their opinions and their chance to express them. But those who takes it to the court of public opinion first is usually the one who can control and craft that story. And everyone knows someone who's going to see it and say, hey, are you the ones involved in this thing? So it's a heavy-handed tactic. And I only do it, after strong consideration, and I don't do it lightly. Had to do it at my last co-op at Park Terrace Gardens because there was selective enforcement of rules. People's personal opinions and likes and biases and, loyalties took precedence over the laws of New York City and New York State. So I fixed that for them. Other situations pop up time and again in life, and you reserve such heavy-handed tactics for when you really need them. But always think in extremes and work in moderation. As long as it's mature adults involved, you can almost always come to a mutually agreeable decision, even if it sometimes involves overriding certain truths that people want to make you believe in that are not. So anyway, before I go off in some directions that are not where I want my mind to be today, I'm going to readjust to the task at hand, which is my next step in going from SEO, search engine optimizer, to Datamaster, which is about what you'll see in the next video. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon, and don't forget to subscribe.